One New York congressman said this in 1976 about this controversy. I quote him. Like blacks, Hispanics, women, and homosexuals, Northeasterners are an oppressed minority. We are only beginning to realize now how badly the federal government discriminates against us. Now that may seem a little bit overheated, and it certainly is, but I want to suggest to you that the Sun Belt-Frost Belt conflict involved something much deeper than a clash over federal dollars, as important as that was. It highlighted truly vast changes, truly vast population and economic changes that the Sun Belt and that the entire nation had been experiencing since World War II. So before we can analyze the implications of this regional power shift for politics and race relations, let me just quickly run you through some of the dimensions of this change. So first and most obvious is population. The South experienced rapid growth, outstripping the Frost Belt. Between 1970 and 1990, for example, the population of the South grew by 40%. That was twice the national growth rate. So that the South's share of the national population went up from roughly a quarter to roughly a third of the nation's total. And this owes to migration. I think you have this chart in the packet we handed out, but if we look, for instance, let's say just at the decade from 1970 to 1980, you can see that while the South experiences about a 9% increase in terms of, that is, there's a 9%, if you take who comes into the region, who goes out, you see a gain of 9%. The Northeast loses 6.5%. The Midwest is losing migrants. So people are moving from those regions into the South and also in large numbers into the West at that time, toward the Sun Belt. So first you have population growth, a shift in population. Second, employment. The South experienced much faster employment growth during the 1960s and 70s than did the Frost Belt, or the whole nation as a whole. So for example, Alabama was the state that had the slowest employment growth, the slowest growth in its number of jobs of any of the Sun Belt states. Still, it grew its jobs at twice the rate of New England, 4 times the rate of New York and Pennsylvania, and it was the slowest growing Sun Belt state. So we have population growth, we have employment growth. The third thing is what economic historians call diversification. That these rapid gains in jobs reflected economic and industrial diversification. So let me explain. Before World War II, as you all certainly know, agriculture dominated the Southern economy. About 35% of Southerners worked on farms in the 1940s. Of those who were classified as industrial workers, the biggest segment worked in low-paying, labor-intensive industries like hosiery and cotton textiles. Here in Mississippi, lumber, sawmills accounted for a huge part of what was called the non-agricultural workforce, the non-farm workforce. And even if you think of lumber as a manufacturing industry, rather than as being just extracting resources from the land, sawmills offered just about the lowest paid and most dangerous jobs that there were. So this emphasis on farming and on low-wage industries meant that the South lacked the purchasing power to fuel economic expansion. So people didn't have much money to spend on things, right? And they also lacked the profits to lure in capital investment, to lure in managerial skills and skilled personnel. Well, by the 1970s, that had all changed. Agriculture remained important, of course, but instead of accounting for a share of total employment that was twice the rest of the country, so in the 1940s, about twice as high a percentage of Southern workers worked on farms as the national average. Well, by the 1970s, it was right at the national average. Most important, however, the region had begun to welcome advanced industry, electronics, aerospace, defense, transportation equipment, cars, trucks, and so on. Those were the fastest growing sectors of the Southern economy by the 1970s. I see wooded parks and big skyscrapers. Tanya Tucker, the country star, could sing in her 1973 hit, "I Believe the South is Gonna Rise Again." I see wooded parks and big skyscrapers where dirty rundown shacks stood once before. I see sons and daughters of sharecroppers, but they're not picking cotton anymore. Well, this raises some questions for us. And the first question is, how do we account for it? What accounts for the Sun Belt's new attractiveness to industry, to skilled workers, to educated managers? What accounted for the so-called favorable business climate that the region's many boosters and promoters pointed to? What kinds of things drove the Sun Belt's economic growth and gave it, in the words of one prominent business consulting firm, its reputation for hospitality to industry? So let's look at some of the factors, some of the possible explanations. Well, as this postcard from the 1960s suggests, most obviously we could point to the South's warm weather and abundant natural resources. After all, a tropical climate and lots of beautiful beaches lured millions of people with lots of money in their pockets to Florida, providing both the markets and the labor supply for the economic boom in Florida. However, unless we agree with one historian who attributes just about all of the region's rapid growth to the widespread installation of air conditioning in the last 50 years, then the South's warm weather and abundant natural resources are important. They may be a necessary precondition, but they're probably not a sufficient explanation for the region's development. After all, the South has always been warm. So we need to look to other factors. So one we might point to is low labor costs, especially low levels of unionization. So this chart here shows you union penetration, what percentage of the workforce are union members, and this is the national trend over time. And I might embarrass myself because I'm colorblind. Is this blue? That line there, all right. So the blue line is all workers. The red line is public sector workers, people that work for government, and the yellow line is private sector workers. And one of the things you can see is that we hit the peak in 1953 when about a third, 33% of the American workforce were union members. And it's been a pretty slow decline. So in fact, right now we're down to about 11% of that workforce. What's interesting here is in 1976, about 25% of all workers were union members, but unions represented only 14% of the South's workforce. By 1984, the national figure had fallen to 18%. Today I said it's about 11%. And one of the most important reasons for the decline of unions is the growth of historically non-union areas like the South and Southwest, and the growth of historically non-union industries like electronics. And so here's a map. This is actually 2011, so this gets us pretty close to the present here. And what you can see is the darker the color, the higher percentage of your labor force is in union. So about a quarter of the New York labor force is still union members, but as you can see with the kind of unusual exception of Alabama, thanks to the steel industry, the South has the lowest level of unionization, and that accounts for, in large part, for the decline of unions nationally, the growth of non-union areas like the South and the Southwest. And Southern state governments, of course, fought mightily to maintain union-free environments. By the 1960s, every Southern state except for Louisiana and Arkansas had adopted right-to-work laws, which limited the ability of unions to organize, to collect dues, to engage in lobbying. So then, to the list of factors for Sun Belt growth, we have weak unions, we have the climate. We can also add industrial Belt promotion efforts, things like subsidies and tax breaks to try to lure factories and employment from the Frost Belt. And Mississippi pioneered that. It was the first state to have such a state program with its Balanced Agriculture with Industry program, launched way back in the 1930s. In the 1950s and 60s, well, just about every southern state had an aggressive program to do so. We also, as we look closer to the recent past, should not discount the long-term effects of the civil rights movement. Because by removing, at least to some extent, the region's bad reputation, its image of violence and discrimination, which had been a brake on many employers and many migrants who might have moved here for economic opportunity, but did not like those things they were seeing on television or reading in their newspaper or worried about them. Certainly that helped to prompt in-migration and the economic development of the Sun Belt. Now, to be sure, all of those forces contributed to the massive changes that the South experienced from the 1960s forward. But I want to argue that no external factor had so great an influence on the rise of the Sun Belt, or would spark so much controversy, as did the intervention of the federal government in Washington. One northern observer went so far as to attribute the entire Sun Belt boom to, in his words, the huge federal presence in this once laggard region. The Southern Rim, this northerner said, was an economy built on money from Washington. Now, if that sounds merely like sour grapes being expressed by a disgruntled Yankee, consider these words from no less a Southern personage than the novelist William Faulkner. We no longer farm in Mississippi cotton fields, the great novelist complained. No longer farm in Mississippi cotton fields. We farm now in Washington corridors and congressional committee rooms. Now that might have somewhat exaggerated the impact of direct federal investment in the South, but if we take that together with some of the indirect effects of government spending and other federal policies, I think it's clear that the feds transformed the South in the half century after World War II. The federal government turned out to be the key factor. This is a map from 1959, and it charts federal payments to state and local governments as a percentage of all the revenue that that state has. And again, the darker you are, the more you're getting, the more reliant the state is on federal money. And as you can see, those Frost Belt states, New York, Massachusetts, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, they're the ones that are not colored in at all. They have the lowest percentage. Florida is another odd case here, but otherwise you can see it's the South and Southwest that are getting the most, right, getting the biggest share of all the revenues directly from the federal government. Now, in fact, you could probably write an entire book on the South's transformation from Cotton Belt to Sun Belt and the ways that the federal government was involved in leading that shift. Actually, I've done it. But I'm going to restrain myself this morning, and instead, I want us to look back again to Kirkpatrick Sale's 5 pillars of Sun Belt growth that I mentioned before, and I want to rename them. I'm going to rename them all. Government, 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 government. So, for example, agribusiness was the first pillar. Well, agribusiness owed its existence as large-scale mechanized production and owed its success to the federal agriculture programs. Federal agriculture programs created modern agribusiness in the South and Southwest and sustained them ever since. Second, oil. Now, I have to admit that oil would have been an economic success even without federal aid. But the industry benefited enormously from federal intervention. Not only subsidies and tax breaks, like the famous or maybe now infamous oil depletion allowance, but from federally subsidized pipeline construction. The federal government, during the Korean War in the 1950s and after, built essentially pipelines and then turned them over to private users in the industries. They also, of course, the federal government, not incidentally for oil, very important for oil, built the interstate highway system beginning in the mid-1950s. Here you see one of the maps for the planned system of interstate highways from before they started, and here is just a picture of one of the first federal highway projects being built with that money. Our third pillar, real estate development, especially a leisure and retirement real estate boom, also benefited, of course, from the construction of national highways, parks, and recreation areas, but it would have been unthinkable without the expansion of Social Security and Medicare, which offered a baseline of retirement security to the elderly. And of course, we have to add military retirement for the South and the Southwest. The Sun Belt would play home to a huge proportion of military personnel and military retirements. More important even, more direct, were pillars 4 and 5 of sales, pillars of Sun Belt growth, defense and technology. For these things turned out in the South to be very closely related. Now, as I'm sure you all know, because you probably drive by them pretty frequently, the South accounted for an outsized share of the nation's military bases. But it also got a disproportionately large share of defense contracts. In fact, Faulkner's words, which he uttered in the aftermath of World War II, became truly accurate, truly prophetic 2 decades later. For Southerners farmed especially well in Washington corridors. Southern leaders became conduits of federal dollars, dams, roads, farm subsidies, and more than anything else, defense spending. Such efforts, for example, made this man, South Carolina Congressman L. Mendel Rivers, legendary. So Rivers, serving first as the second-ranking member and eventually as the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, poured into his district in South Carolina an Air Force base, a naval base, a Polaris Missile Maintenance Center, a naval shipyard, a ballistic submarine training station, a naval hospital, a Coast Guard station, a mine warfare center, and the 6th Naval District headquarters. I can barely get that list out without losing my breath. And if that wasn't enough, defense contractors like McDonnell Douglas and General Electric and Lockheed all established factories in the district during Rivers' chairmanship of the committee. By some estimates, as much as 1/3 of the income in the area and as much as half of the employment in the district was defense related. There was so much stuff crammed down there that one of Rivers' colleagues on the committee joked, "You put anything else down there in your district, Mendel, it's going to sink." What's interesting and important to note, though, is that Rivers gave as well as he received. He was an influential and steadfast supporter of the military. In fact, not only did he repeatedly shut down debate on the defense budget and ram it through, but he even occasionally appropriated more funds than the military brass had even requested. He gave them more than they wanted. He liked to speak to military audiences, and when he spoke before them, he routinely mocked liberal civilians. So I'm going to give you one of his lines, but it doesn't work without the accent, and I can't really do the accent, so just bear with me. "The only powder those people have ever smelled is talcum powder," he said of liberal civilians. "The only war they've ever been in is a boudoir." Boudoir. The only rivals, and if Rivers was maybe the most egregious or the most successful at this, but if he had other rivals for it, it was other Southerners. Which brings us then to space and aerospace, one of those last pillars of Sun Belt growth. Because no program better demonstrated the alliance between congressional leadership, military spending, and Southern economic development than the space program. Believe it or not, before the Soviet Union shocked the United States in 1957 with the launch of Sputnik, the first satellite to reach Earth orbit, Southern politicians had had very little interest in rocketry. In fact, Apollo program later on. Houston's congressman had crusaded against spending any money on rocketry. He thought it was a waste. But no sooner had Sputnik's first beep beep been heard, or so one Defense Department official recalled, than Southern legislators leaped forward like heavy drinkers hearing a cork pop. A group of Southerners led by the then Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson steered a space bill through the Congress in 1958. Johnson and his fellow Southerners in Congress really saw the space bill as a main chance to develop their region, and NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, paid back rich loyalties to its Southern benefactors. So what kind of benefits came here from the space program? Well, first, research funds went to Southern universities. And in fact, an entire campus, the University of Alabama at Huntsville, was built just to take advantage of NASA funds, stemming from the Marshall Space Center that was built in Huntsville, Alabama. And all kinds of high-tech firms, including IBM and Rockwell, moved to Huntsville, moved to northern Alabama.